Okay, well, I'm just here to introduce Professor Candida Moss, and it gives me great pleasure to do that. Now, given all that we've said about the public engagement with theology, I can hardly imagine a better choice of speaker. So, Candida Moss is Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at the University of Notre Dame, where she is also a concurrent Professor of Classics. She holds a BA from the University of Oxford, an MAR in Biblical Studies from Yale Divinity School, and a PhD from Yale University. The award-winning author of 6 books and over 30 scholarly articles, including The Other Christs, Ancient Christian Martyrdom, and Reconceiving Infertility, she has held fellowships and won prizes from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and the John Templeton Foundation. A columnist for the Daily Beast, she is a frequent contributor to, amongst other things, The Atlantic, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek Slate, The Washington Post, CNN, the BBC, and Politico. She also serves as a CBS news commentator for religious and papal affairs and comments on breaking news stories for CNN, Fox News, and NBC. Now, the title of this year, the Cadbury Lectures, is Heavenly Bodies, Resurrecting Perfection in the New Testament and Early Church. And just to give you an overview of what the overall lectures are about, there's a brief statement here which I'll just read out. The resurrection of the body is one of the foundational statements of Christian theology. In this mini-series of public lectures, Professor Moss will explore what the New Testament actually has to say about the resurrection of the body and show how failing to recognize reading our cultural assumptions into the text of the Bible can marginalize members of our own communities. Now, before I end up giving a rather poor lecture already, let me hand over to our Professor Candida Moss. You're welcome.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. One always sounds much better in summary than one is in real life. Since the 2nd century, belief in the resurrection of Jesus and its latter days counterpart, the resurrection of everybody else, has been a litmus test for membership in Orthodox Christianity. If Christ was not raised from the dead, Paul would say, our faith has been in vain. And thus, in the vacated space of the empty tomb, Christianity very self-consciously laid its foundations. And so it is that the narratives about Jesus' resurrection have received so much attention. Not only the historicity of the events, but the origins of resurrection in the history of ideas, the supposed uniqueness and thus significance of this event, and the seemingly impossible metaphysics of resurrection have been pulled, prodded, and dissected. When it comes to talking about the resurrection, much, some would say everything, is at stake. Yet for all of the scrutiny of the process of resurrection, Jesus' actual resurrected body receives a rather superficial examination. There's a preponderance of confusing language used to describe Jesus' body and its form. He's initially unrecognizable in John, being mistaken for a gardener by Mary Magdalene. He is both resistant to touch before his ascent to the Father and inviting of human contact when it comes to Thomas. He can appear in locked rooms at an instance and yet vanish without a trace. And in both Luke and John, there is something distinctive about Jesus' hands and feet. Although we should not necessarily be so sure that we know what that distinctive thing is. Yet despite the overwhelming references to Jesus' body, in fact, there were arguably more here in the resurrection than there are for his pre-mortem body, there is strikingly little close examination of his bodily characteristics. Expansive questions about metaphysics are regularly posed. But in recent scholarship, and with the exception of Stephen Moore, the aesthetics of Jesus' body are less discussed than you would think. With that in mind, my first talk will focus on a single aspect of the narratives about the resurrected body of Jesus, the marks of execution on his hands and side in the Gospel of John. In the narrative itself, the marks are the means by which Jesus is identified, and the reality of the resurrection is confirmed. Thomas's moment of recognition provides the pretext for a brief but important excursus on the merits of faith. Certainly, we should agree with John Ashton that belief is a central portion of the Doubting Thomas exchange, but given the numerous narrative tensions and the metaphysical questions raised by this episode, we must ask, does the palpability of Jesus' body mean nothing to John? In scholarship, the presence of the marks of the nails in Jesus' hands has been read as anti-docetic polemic, that is, proof that Jesus was really a human being and not just a god meandering around in human form. It has also been used as a sign of resurrection apologetics, and somewhat humorously, it has been seen as evidence that Jesus never really died, but was taken down from the cross alive, was buried, and stumbled out of the tomb a few days later. When extended discussion of these marks have taken place, the issue has often been the historicity of the use and placement of the nails in crucifixion. Was it the palm of his hand, or was it his wrist? But the question of how or why Jesus continues after death to be marked, and what difference this might make to our reading of this passage, is never really addressed. Instead, and in keeping with an interpretive and artistic tradition that portrays Jesus with ragged puncture wounds, it tends to be assumed that the resurrected body of Jesus that Thomas reaches out to touch is freshly wounded and porous. This subject is important, not only because the resurrection has been and continues to be a fundamental dogmatic claim for Christians today, but also because, as Paul suggests, the manner in which everyone will be resurrected is patterned after the resurrection of Jesus. So if Jesus is resurrected, is recognized by his infirmities in the resurrection, then should we not imagine that the resurrection of everyone else will similarly preserve their pre-mortem infirmities? Yet, with the exception of a few patristic authors like Augustine, who imagine that the martyrs will be resurrected with beautifying scars where their previously severed limbs were reattached, the dominant view has seen resurrection as some kind of process of eschatological healing for the rest of us. This is something I'll be talking about later on. Disability studies theologians, including myself, have argued that if impairments are integral for recognizing Jesus, then they are integral for everyone else. The eradication of these features of our identity in the eschaton would amount to nothing other than a kind of heavenly eugenics. So in turning my attention to this particular aspect of the resurrection of the body, I was inclined, I dare say eager, to further argue that the theological importance of these wounds in understanding who Jesus was in his resurrection was critically important for us too. If only the scriptural and ancient evidence had bent to my will. Instead, I would like to suggest that we reconsider the assumptions we make about these wounds and their function in the program of early Christianity. New Testament scholarship has made two logically related but sometimes independent arguments about the function of the marks of the nails for the author of the Gospel of John, and indeed just for our understanding of the resurrection of Jesus. which encompasses this passage from Luke as well. The first is, these wounds demonstrate that it's really the same Jesus who is appearing. In other words, they're about identification. The second is a question of metaphysics. They prove that he's not an apparition, that he has what we might call a real body, a physical, material body, something you could touch. He is not a ghost. In other words, the purpose of these wounds is either identification or providing tangible proof of a resurrected body, or perhaps both of those things. Those like Sandra Schneider's, who think Jesus' resurrected body is not physical, emphasize identification, while others, and he's perhaps well known to you like N.T. Wright, focus on the tangibility of the resurrected body as proof of its historical certainty. Most scholars make their arguments based on the assumption that Jesus' marks are open wounds. And what I want to argue today is that whatever position you take on the function of the marks and the substance of Jesus' body, your argument would be vastly improved if you took the marks of the nails not as wounds, but as scars. Even for those scholars, and I'm sure some of you are in the room, who think literal readings of the resurrection are naive, to say nothing of a little bit disgusting, and who treat the resurrection scenes as symbolic signs or metaphors about transformation, the symbolic function of the Doubting Thomas episode is sharpened when Jesus' body is read as scarred rather than wounded. Before we can get to how critical arguments are improved by reading the marks of scars, I need to first show you why scars is just a better reading than open wounds, just on the face of the text. Of our canonical four, only Luke and John include any kind of narrative autopsy. In Luke, Jesus displays his hands and feet to the disciples. You'll note there's no reference to wounds here. We're instructed to ruminate on his body, but instead of any kind of detailed literary description, we find a kind of narrative silence that you have to fill for yourself in your own imagination. Even if there's something distinctive about Jesus' extremities, we're not sure what that is. Perhaps he was resurrected without a scratch. Perhaps his wounds were open and exposed for viewing, or perhaps we're somewhere between pristine new flesh and punctured old. We simply don't know from reading Luke. In language similar to, and perhaps even dependent on Luke, John uses Thomas to linger over the contours of the resurrected body. Thomas was evidently missing at the earlier appearances and famously declared, according to the NRSV translation, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." The ambiguity of the language yields a variety of possible interpretations. What did the mark of the nails look like? Many commentators refer to them simply as marks, and that's a rhetorical move that allows the scholar to remain sort of non-committal on the issue and avoid any sort of embarrassing connotations of late medieval Catholic spirituality about bleeding saints. Those few scholars who refer to Jesus as scarred do so without any reflection on what that might mean, and they tend to use scars just as sort of a synonym for wound. The dominant interpretation of this scene, however, is one in which Jesus is still openly wounded, and Thomas demands to insert his finger into Jesus' hand and side. A significant proportion of scholars will refer to the marks directly as wounds. Daniel Harrington, for example, writes that by, quote, placing his finger into the wounds and by placing his hand in his side, Thomas will receive proof of the resurrection. But is that what John intends us to understand here? The situation is not helped by the fact that we don't know if Thomas did touch Jesus. While some Alexandrian exegetes like Origen and Cyril thought that Thomas did place his hand in Jesus' side, others like Augustine were uncertain. The rich legacy of medieval artwork has led us to believe that we can see through the holes in Jesus' hands, but the phrase mark of the nails is much more ambiguous and peculiar than that. Certainly, Thomas does expect to be able to touch the body of Jesus and see if it yields to his hand, but nothing about the Greek grammar here insists that his touch will be penetrative rather than probative. Thomas expresses a desire to put his finger and hand into the marks of the nails inside in all English translations, but the preposition eis and the accusative can, as every first-year student of Greek can tell you, can mean either motion towards or location in. So there's a good reason to follow the traditional interpretation of this passage, but grammatically, it is equally acceptable to see Thomas as desiring to place his fingers on Jesus rather than more suggestively into him. The curious phrase, mark of the nails, hardly resolves this issue. John does not use the kind of military or medical language that would settle things for us. The word that is used for mark here is tupoi, which can be used to refer to a mold or a shape on which other things were modeled, which in part explains why in ancient philosophy this term was used for kind of a primordial archetype. But it can also refer to the effect of a blow or pressure. The term was sometimes used to describe the effect of impressions of images on your eyes that impress themselves on your eyeballs in the act of singing, according to some ancient philosophers. But generally, it was more commonly used to describe the impression left by a horse's hoof, the uneven surface produced by the stamping of seals, the indentation produced by engraving, and the mint marks that were made in the process of striking coins. In other words, tupoi can either be outlined to be copied or deep impressions left by the application of pressure. Thus, where tupoi are the result of pressure, they are uneven impressions on an otherwise smooth surface. And this would seem to me to be a fine description of a scar. It's the bump you would encounter if you ran your finger over otherwise smooth skin. It's for this reason that the more usual word for a scar in Greek and oule was sometimes used to describe things that were just wrinkly. There is, in fact, an occasion in Philo's laws where tupoi appears to describe the impressions left by old wounds. In arguing how foolish it is that those marked with physical wounds are prevented from participating in the priesthood, Philo writes that moral offenses also leave a mark, saying that the scars and impressions, the oulai kai tupoi, of these sinners' old offenses remain not the less in the souls of those who repent. The semantic range of tupoi does not seem to include marks that penetrate an object entirely. To my knowledge, there are no instances in Greek literature where tupos is used to describe a through and through puncture. Even without necessarily arguing that John knows Philo, which a number of scholars have argued, the philological evidence suggests that John, like Philo, could use the term tupoi to refer to scarring. When Thomas says he wants to place his finger into the marks of the nails, he might actually mean he wants to place his finger on or in the creases of a healing or scarred wound, rather than into open holes. To this, we can add ancient expectations about bodily healing. Greco-Roman medicine sheds some light on how someone in the ancient audience of John's Gospel might have understood this scene. Galen, the famous 2nd century doctor whose primary training involved tending to Roman gladiators, provides ample evidence about the rather public rehabilitation of those injured in the arena. So Galen spent a lot of time tending to gladiators, and he saw a lot of wounds. And he notes this: in fact, it is in the ability of anyone who wishes to do so to see in a very large number of those who engage in single combat every day, that's gladiators, major wounds scabbing over without inflammation, so that by the 2nd or 4th day they are totally out of danger. This kind of healing was evidently not the result of Galen's own technological innovations, but something that was fairly common in the ancient world. He later notes in On Venesection that it's possible for the vein to reunite without becoming inflamed, for we have frequently witnessed among the gladiators a whole thigh or arm which is cut open and would heal before displaying inflammation, and especially as Hippocrates says, whenever there happens to be a profuse and immediate bleeding. Now you may be thinking, I just don't believe this because I know about modern medicine. But there's some archaeological evidence to suggest that Galen is not overstating his own abilities. In 1993, there was a 2nd century cemetery just for Roman gladiators that was discovered in Ephesus. And there was ample osteoarchaeological evidence that people suffered large wounds and lived for some time after receiving these blows. Arguably, therefore, your average ancient reader might expect that a living body that had sustained a significant wound several days earlier would already have been healed to the point that the wounds were no longer open and bleeding. Now, it may seem oddly literalist to think about the resurrected body in terms of ordinary healing. After all, it was just resurrected from the dead. But if the point of this narrative is in part to demonstrate that this is the same body that was in the tomb, then the rules of ordinary human healing might be just what was required for the purposes of establishing continuity and identification. Even assuming that the cold, dead body of Jesus did not heal when it was in the tomb, because in ancient medical theory, hot blood wasn't available to heal the wound, and I think we all agree, Thomas and the audience might well expect that Jesus' body would already be healed over a week later when Jesus appears to Thomas, if not on the 2nd day when Thomas doubts. The scarring process, or at least, forgive me, the scabbing process, would already have begun. I don't want to press this point too forcefully, but it's worth noting that the healing process in ancient medicine is very different for larger wounds, like the wound in the side. So Galen distinguishes between those wounds that require only the joining of flesh and those wounds that require the production of new flesh and sutures in order to heal. If the wound in the side is larger, then it might fit this sort of latter category of a larger wound that needs sutures. And this explanation could account for the different ways that Thomas describes Jesus' hand and side. It could also explain the very influential patristic early church interpretation that assumed that his side remained open, but his hands were scarred or even healed. I bet you weren't even looking at his hands the first time. But you'll notice that the good artists agree with me. Edward Burne-Jones doesn't even have marks at all in the stained glass behind me. The differential diagnosis would have permitted the wound in Jesus' side to symbolize the openness of the church, the collapsing of heavenly and earthly worlds, and salvation in general. So we don't have to assume that the state of his hands and side are identical, nor does John's language necessarily lead us to believe that they are. So, other than just ruining your appetites by dragging you into the somewhat gruesome specifics of wound healing right before dinner, you might wonder, what sort of difference do scarred wounds make to our interpretation of this passage? What does this get us? I want to suggest that understanding the mark of the nails as scars can yield interpretations that open wounds failed to do. If someone told you that the fact that he has wounds proves that he was resurrected from the dead and not a ghost, say Tom Wright, for example, they were wrong. The first, though, is to do with identification. I mentioned this at the beginning of my talk. Scars were the ultimate form of identification in the ancient world. In the context of what was called narrative recognition, or anagnorisis, healed wounds, that's scars, are more useful than recent ones. This detail tends to be overlooked by New Testament scholars, but there are no examples of this kind of recognition that involve fresh wounds. Perhaps the most famous example of this, identification by scar motif, is the recognition of the disguised Odysseus in the Odyssey. Knowing that he will be recognized if his nurse sees his old hunting wound above his knee, Odysseus retreats into the shadows, but he's unmasked when the nurse is washing his leg and feels the mark of the wound. This moment of recognition is tied to the experience of touching the crinkled skin on the surface of Odysseus's body. This episode is arguably the most famous example of recognition in the ancient world. It's cited by Aristotle in his Poetics as one of the preeminent examples of recognition. Thus, not only would Jesus' scars have been, as others have shown, the appropriate culmination of a succession of scenes throughout John in which Jesus is made known to people, but it's actually archetypal for the audience. And it amplifies the contrast between Thomas and Mary Magdalene. In the garden, Jesus told Mary Magdalene not to touch me. But with history's emblematic doubter, he invites physical encounter. Simultaneously, the location of his scars is a witness to his character and manliness. In the words of Xenophon, scars borne by virtuous men are visible signs of virtue, so that not by hearsay, but by evidence of their own eyes, men can judge what manner of a person someone is. What this meant that was often when Romans were running for political office, they would expose their bare breasts with their war wounds, the scars on them, and they would say, "Look at my scars as proof of my courage." It's almost sort of a commonplace in Roman oratory by the time of John's writing. Scars become visible tokens of virtue and patriotism and render verbal defense sometimes even unnecessary. So Josephus tells a story of the appearance of Antipater, who was accused of treason before Caesar Augustus. And Antipater appears there and he throws off his garments and he has no occasion to say a word because his body cried aloud. At the same time, scars can be marks of shame and degradation. They can be the stigmata of a servile body. We might compare Livy's language of honorable scars received on the front with the foul scars of slavery that are received on the back from beatings, presumably. If we hold, with New Testament scholar Lou Martin, that Paul's stigmata that Paul refers to are the marks on his back from literal beatings, it is significant that neither Luke nor John has Jesus reveal those tupoi to Thomas. Jesus doesn't uncover the marks of his flogging for his audience, even though presumably he would have some. If in Paul, these marks are what Stephen Moore has called the map of Paul's missionary journeys that has been cut into his back, the marks on Jesus' body are carefully curated. This is not a tale of bodily openness, it's a performance of identity and virtue. The Johannine Jesus then offers not hands and feet as in Luke, but hands and side. The piercing of the side is delivered by a Roman soldier, and thus, to an extent, it's a martial wound. Were this a different gospel, let's say Mark, we might think that it was almost ironic, a sort of parody of a war wound, but we have to take seriously the extent to which John sees the crucifixion as a moment of exaltation. He frequently calls it Jesus being exalted, lifted up. The crucifixion isn't humbling for John. It's not degrading, and thus the piercing of the side is an honorable wound. Just as the scars of virtue in Roman oratory harken back to acts of military triumph in battle, so too the display of Jesus' side refers us to a climactic moment in John's glorifying version of the cross. Jesus isn't scarred by vices, he bears marks of virtue. By mapping the sites of inspection onto his crucifixion scene, John steers us even further from the shameful wounds of flogging, potentially alluded to by Paul, and towards the more familiar, ennobling scarring of Roman speeches. And in the process, he uses the cultural significance of scarring to knit together the crucifixion and resurrection scenes, which otherwise in John, you don't really need a resurrection because the crucifixion is so glorifying. The second and more physicalized function of the scars is that they communicate something important, indeed absolutely central, about the nature of Jesus' resurrected body. As I noted earlier, some scholars claim that the presence of wounds and the tangible physicality of Jesus' body demonstrate that he's a person, he's not a phantasm or a ghost. This argument is actually an ancient one. Cyril of Alexandria notes in his commentary on John that by showing his wounded side and the mark of the nails, he convinced us beyond a doubt that he had raised a temple of his own body, the very body that had hung on the cross. This patristic view is reiterated by modern scholars like Tom Wright, who remarks that the evidence that Jesus himself rose with the same body as before is provided by the mark of the nails. Except it isn't. The essential incompatibility of ghostliness and physical tangibility is a very common belief. Among ancient authors, we need look no further than the influential description of Odysseus' mother in Homer. So Odysseus travels to the underworld and there he sees his mother. She's described as a soul. She's a suke, and she flies through his hands like a shadow or even a dream. This, we're told, is because this is just what happens when the body dies. Life leaves the body, leaves the bones in particular, and the soul, that's suke again in Greek, like a dream, flies about and flies away. The same idea is also present in the Iliad, by the way, where the suke can't actually be touched, but it's described as being like a vapor, almost like a gas. There's a soul in an image, we're told, but there's no real heart in it, and that's Homer's own language. It's very unfortunate that this Homeric view coincides exactly with our own kind of pop cultural understanding of ghosts, from everything from Scooby-Doo to modern ghost stories. Under Homer's influence, commentators on Luke and John will regularly remark that ghosts are intangible entities that are incapable of eating or of being grasped, and thus that touching Jesus proves that he was indeed no ghost. But if we look outside of Homer, we'll see that there's a whole cast of ancient apparitional characters, each bearing their own metaphysical and physical characteristics. Everything from disembodied spirits, like Odysseus's mothers, to revenants, a word for which I can thank Leonardo DiCaprio for making intelligible to us all. There are reanimated corpses, what we might call zombies, and there were the spirits of heroes that were ritually tied to the place of their burial. Now, time doesn't permit me to give you a full survey, although I'm sure you'd love it. But there are a couple of notable incidents that I want to mention here. In particular, there are stories involving reanimated corpses that demonstrate that reanimated corpses are both palpable and capable in engaging in the activities of the living. In Phlegon's 2nd century Book of Marvels, which is amazing if you like reading ghost stories, a young girl named Philenion emerges at night from her family tomb in order to liaise with a male houseguest. During her periods of reanimation, which last anywhere from some minutes to several days, she eats, she drinks, and she engages in sexual intercourse. According to Phlegon, this was quite traumatic for the young man when he realized she was dead. There is, in fact, a parallel to this story in Euripides, who describes Admetus, who's very cautious when he's reunited with his dead wife because he thinks maybe she's a ghost. In short, if we look beyond Homer, we can see that for many ancient authors and readers, while the intangibility of a form is proof of ghostliness, the ability to touch a person is no assurance that he or she is actually alive. In the case of the preservation of bodily wounds, the issue is still more complicated. As any reader of ancient mythological tours of the underworld knows, the shade or suke of a person preserves not only their sort of infirmities into ancient eyes, their deformities, but also the wounds that caused their death. On the preservation of the pre-mortem form in the post-mortem body, Plato, the philosophical Plato, insists that if anyone's body was large by nature or by feeding, or by both, when they were alive, their corpse will be large when they're dead. And if they were fat, it will be fat after death. And if anyone had been a sturdy rogue and bore traces of his stripes in scars on his body, whether from the whip or from other wounds, while yet alive, then after death too, his body has these marks visible upon it. Or if anyone's limbs were broken or distorted in life, these same effects are manifest in death. When Aeneas journeys to the afterlife in Virgil's Aeneid, he encounters his former beloved Dido, and he describes her wounds as still fresh in the underworld. When he meets Eriphyle, who is another victim of unhappy love, she is in tears as she displays the wounds her cruel son had given her. All of which is to say that the presence and display of mortal wounds is not de facto proof of life. Wound healing is not possible in corpses, even ambulatory ones. Galen is very clear that the blood doesn't flow without heat, and that both are required for new flesh to be supplied with serious wounds. Nor do physically touchable ghosts and ethereal shades exhibit signs of healing in the afterlife. As a rebuttal to the potential anti-resurrection objection that what the disciples saw was a mere apparition, not a truly resurrected body, the presence of visible wounds is not and would not have been particularly convincing. In other words, the touchable wounds of Jesus do not necessarily do the rhetorical work that scholars and Christian apologists imagine that they do. By contrast, the scarring of Jesus' body proves, in ways that having an open wound does not, that the self-same Jesus that was crucified is now actually alive. If Thomas is, as many have argued, the spokesperson for a contemporary skeptical position on bodily resurrection, then his desire to see scars rather than wounds is very well made. Real bodies heal themselves. In asking for tangible scars, Thomas would be asking for proof of life rather than proof of mere animation. Any corpse can get up and walk around in the ancient world. If, and I think the scene leads us to this conclusion, if one aspect of the Johannine author's agenda is to communicate that Jesus is not part of the phantasmic world, then healing wounds, an indisputable proof of life, express this point and head off at the pass the potential objection that Jesus is either a ghost or a revenant. There are thus significant rhetorical advantages to seeing the wounds of crucifixion as scars. Yet we might still feel that these rather base apologetic skirmishes are beneath John. It might seem as if I'm dragging our normally philosophical fourth evangelist into the muddy specifics of material resurrection. After all, when we think of the Gospel of John, don't we think philosophy? To an extent, this is a problem one encounters merely from the act of reading chapters 19 to 20 as a single entity. So if you want to argue, and there are scholars who have argued this, Rudolf Bultmann and Ernst Henschen in particular, that the author of John doesn't think that Jesus has a physical resurrected body at all, then you would probably have to perform the same exegetical move of relegating the wounds of Jesus, whether open or scarred, it doesn't matter, to some kind of primitive strata in the tradition, something much earlier that John just neglected to fix. But if you don't embrace Bultmann's source-critical division, if you think that this is part of the Gospel of John, then the fact that Jesus is described in corporeal terms, indeed his body is more scrutinized here than anywhere else, renders the characteristics of that body important. Moreover, and whether or not an individual scholar or reader finds the fourth evangelist too philosophical for the pragmatics of healing corpses, the fact of the matter is that John unambiguously depicts a body in transition. Between his encounter with Mary Magdalene in the garden and his appearance to Thomas and the disciples in the upper room, something, likely his ascent to the Father, has rendered him available to human touch. Even if there's no record of Thomas actually touching Jesus, the body of the resurrected Jesus is both changing and increasingly palpable. These aspects of the resurrected body in John 20 jar with any idea of spiritual, pneumatic resurrection that you would get from Paul and 1 Corinthians. And it jars with Platonic dualism and the idea that we inhabit this world of the flesh divorced from the world of the mind. It jars with those equally, whether you understand the marks of the nails as scars or gaping wounds. Moreover, the metaphysical worldview that attempts to divorce our sort of clodden, heavy bodies from our psychic or spiritual ones never fully succeeds. So long as the pneumatic body, that's the spiritual body, so long as it continues to be described in anthropomorphized terms, it's harnessed to the aesthetics of the material world. It's tempting to think that variations in wound healing, skin rippling, and so forth would be unimportant to an author so demonstrably influenced by Platonism. But wherever you find anthropomorphized bodies, there you find aesthetics. And this is true not only of Platonism. Think back to the passage from the Gorgias we just read. It's true of language in general. It is impossible to to use the human form to represent anything, no matter how insubstantial, without invoking real bodies and the values placed on the characteristics of those bodies. The symbolism of healing, which had positive metaphorical value everywhere, can express something positive about the process of resurrection versus other forms of post-mortem incorporeal existence. There is much to be said about Johannine metaphysics, its eschatology, his ideas about resurrection for everyone else, and I'm not committing to any particular view of the substance of Jesus' body. My point is this: whether one thinks of the resurrected body in John as physical or not, a commitment to Platonic dualism or Stoic physics in no way precludes an interest in at least the symbolic value of the physical form of Jesus' resurrected body. What I hope to have shown so far is how examining the marks on Jesus' body more closely and considering the possibility that he is scarred and not simply wounded can affect our understanding of the resurrection. Whether you think of the marks primarily as a means of identifying Jesus or as a key piece of evidence about the living substance of the resurrected body, scars do the work that scholars have erroneously thought open wounds do. Scars add texture and depth to our reading of the scene. We should further note, although I have only alluded to it here, that there is a pronounced interpretive tradition from the patristic period onwards that sees the mark of the nails as scars, even as it continues to mull over the theological significance of the open wound in Jesus' side. Interpretive traditions are not proof of authorial intent, but they do show that I'm not alone in reading John this way. Arguably, in positing verbal and conceptual differences between the scars in Jesus' hands and the wound in his side, patristic authors preserve something about John's use of tupoi that we modern interpreters have missed. In the end, when it comes to the function of the scars, perhaps John plays with the malleability of Jesus' body in multiple ways. For those mired in the polemics that surrounded the resurrection of Jesus, he provides a body that's demonstrably alive, virtuous and identifiable. Thomas is portrayed as a reluctant witness, and thus he's an especially compelling one. For those who grimace at the quaintness of a resurrected corpse, in the ancient world and perhaps even in this room, he uses the changing state of Jesus' scars to direct us to larger Johannine themes of transformation and revelation. That John uses this kind of gradated discourse does not mean that he does not have a preference about how we should read this passage. If Thomas is the opportunity for a reflection on belief in Jesus, then we should note that the one who touches ranks lower than those who merely see, and lower still than the broader audience of the Gospel of John who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Ultimately, those who decline to probe the resurrected body with their hands, their eyes, and perhaps also their questions, are those presented to us as exemplar. And an observation like that should clearly be my final statement on the subject for today. Thank you.